Okay, hello everybody. Yeah, see a lot of familiar faces here popping up on my screen, and some of you already know me from previous OLLI workshops, classical music workshops. Others don't. This is something totally different. And I thought that when the opportunity, to have something during the summer came up, it would be nice to have something that made us feel a little bit less stir crazy. Maybe we've all been stuck at home, travels cancelled. I should be in France at the moment. It looks as if I'm in France at the moment, but in fact, I'm in Stony Brook, New York. And it's very frustrating when your travel plans have to be abandoned. So I thought how nice it would be to take a little tour. And in this case, a tour de France, where I've spent a lot of time, many summers, winters too. And it's a very appropriate destination today, because today is in fact the 14th of July, the Bastille Day, French national holiday, the equivalent of the 4th of July. So I've got some pictures to show you, and I'm going to switch screens so I can show them and get my face out of the way. Let's go straight to this one, which is a little memorial of the storming of the Bastille, or the Bastille as it should be, on July the 14th, 1789, which released a rather disappointing total of 7 political prisoners and launched the French Revolution. And the interesting thing about this is how small events can have huge consequences. The crowd that stormed the Bastille was really only about the size of the riot that happened the other day in Minneapolis. And yet it launched the French Revolution and turned Europe completely upside down. So the lesson of that is, as my mother used to say, you never know. Now, people love to look for their roots these days, although it might be a mistake. My roots, insofar as I have any, are about 50% in France, as you can guess from the name. And a couple of my aunts spent a lot of time trying to dig into the family history and discovering where we came from and what kind of people we were. And there are different stories. One of them is that when the family came over from France in 1804, that date is fairly solid, they were in fact a family of circus performers. And not to put too fine a point on it, they were a family of clowns. And well, let me just back up that a little bit. The first idea was that they were a family of butchers, because that's what the name means, Bouchier. The second idea, which came from one of my interesting aunts, was that it was a family of French clowns. And they look so much like my family that I'm rather inclined to believe that version. In any case, millions of people were coming over from Europe at that time, 1804, because it was the year that Napoleon proclaimed himself the emperor. And of course, it's no accident. People do not want to be in a country where emperors are in charge. And millions of Europeans, as I say, were coming to England and then going on to America. But my ancestors got stuck in England. There's Napoleon in all his glory, but it didn't last all that long. If you look at the map, you can see that the distance between France and England, I'm sure you know this already, is actually very short. It's about the same as the distance of crossing Long Island Sound on the ferry. It takes about an hour and a half. Now, of course, there's a tunnel as well. But from the point of view of my family, once they got into England, they really transformed themselves into proper English people and forgot all about France, didn't believe in foreign places, didn't believe in foreign languages or foreign food. So we never crossed that narrow little strip of sea the whole time I was growing up. Of course, there was a war going on as well. And I first got to France in 1955. I must have been 16, I suppose. And I got a little motorcycle and I took it over on the boat and went driving down to Paris, which is a wonderfully adventurous and stupid thing for a 16-year-old to do, but I had a most wonderful time. I discovered French food, which was a revelation after wartime, British food, I discovered the pleasures of driving on the wrong side of the road. And in particular, I discovered that my school French was absolutely useless. Everything I'd learned in school was incomprehensible to the French. But nevertheless, you know, your first experience of a country is always tremendously strong, one way or the other, positive or negative. And my experience was very, very positive back then, a long time ago. And so it became sort of not exactly my country, but my second country, if you like. Benjamin Franklin said, a famous statement, every man has two countries, his own and France. And maybe what he meant was that we all have a real country that we live in and an ideal country that we dream about. France was Thomas Jefferson's ideal country too, so it has a lot of connections with the United States one way or another. If you look back a little bit at the history, the blue on this map here is the French territory in America before 1803, before the Louisiana Purchase. And if you travel out across the Midwest, you come across French names constantly, Des Moines, Notre Dame, Baton Rouge, Lafayette, and so on, just as you come across Spanish names on the West Coast. So there's a tremendous intertwining of American history and French history. There's a good argument to make that the American Revolution would have been lost without the help of the French Army and Navy. If you read about the Battle of Yorktown, the defeat of Lord Cornwallis, most unfortunate, you'll see that the French had a huge part to play in that. So the connection's always been there, and it's sometimes been a positive one, sometimes a negative one. About 1.5 million Americans every year go to Paris alone. And Paris is the sort of romantic and spectacular epicenter of France and French history. All those kings and princes and all that fashion and beauty. It's a place that attracts people from all over the world. Say nothing of the art and literature scene in the 20s, you know, with Gertrude Stein, Ernest Hemingway, and all the rest of them. Paris is just one of those cities that is a worldwide magnet. And I've been to Paris. I've lived in Paris from time to time. And I must admit, I don't necessarily share everybody else's enormous enthusiasm for it. It's a beautiful city, spectacular city, but it's a city. And I was born and brought up in London, and I'd had enough of cities. I really wanted to be out of cities and into the countryside. So as soon as I'd visited Paris, I immediately went out and started exploring the countryside. You know, Paris is not France any more than New York is the United States of America. It's a country with multiple cultures, even multiple languages. And the vast majority of France is made up of countryside and small towns and villages. France is actually about the same size as Texas, if you take off the panhandle. There's a book I wrote a few years ago, 3 years ago, about living in France, and it has 10 or so essays on Paris, but most of it, the other 50 or so essays, are all about village life. If you're not careful, I may read one or two to you a little bit later on. So let's get out of Paris straight away and go south to this area. It won't mean much if you're not familiar with the map of Paris, but the map of France. But this is the very south coast. It's the area that everyone calls the south of France, which the French call, very confusingly, the Midi. It's not really the Midi, it's the south, but it's south of the 45th parallel, roughly. And a lot of people have different ideas of what that means, the south of France. A lot of people see it as the coastline, the Côte d'Azur, the great expensive cities of Nice and Cannes and Monaco and Cap d'Antibes and so on. Whenever you hear about celebrities running off to France, they're always going to the south coast. They're always along that coast there, which is very beautiful, Côte d'Azur. Then there's a second stereotype, if I could say, of the south of France, which is all down to an author called Peter Mayle, who back in 1989 wrote a book called The Year in Provence, which was a tremendous bestseller. It's a sort of idealization of a certain kind of French life. I call these kinds of books travel pornography. But once The Year in Provence was published, everybody else had to publish one too. So there was a year in Rome, there was a year in Madrid, and so on and so on. Everybody got into the act. For a while, it was quite a minor industry in the travel publishing business. But I want to point out that there's a lot more to the south of France than just the Côte d'Azur and Provence. There's this whole area that you see on this map. I don't have a pointer that I can point with, but in the map over to the left-hand side, going down from the Rhone, which is right in the middle there, where Avignon is, right the way down to the Spanish border, that brown area down at the bottom left-hand side there. That's the rest of the south of France. And going down on the train, we usually fly to Paris and go down on the high-speed train, which is a pleasure in itself, much faster than the Long Island Railroad, I can tell you that. The first sign that you see that you're really in the south are these beautiful slender trees, the cypresses. And that always gives me a tremendous lift. I say, okay, we're nearly there. When you see cypresses, when you see mountains, then you're getting there. Cypress tree has got its own legend, as everything does. It's the story of one of those wonderful Greek myths, the story of a young, beautiful, tall, slender man called Cyparissus, who was loved by Apollo, but made the mistake of killing Apollo's favorite stag. And Apollo, you know, the gods in ancient Greece were revengeful and nasty. Apollo turned him into a tree, a cypress tree, which became a symbol of mourning and still is seen that way. But there they are, the beautiful cypresses. And we went, well, I went down there for many years on and off various trips. And one year was, I think it was the fateful year 2000. We had the opportunity to rent a place in the south for a year. And it was too good a chance to miss. It was very inexpensive. We wanted to have that experience of being in a village for a whole year. And unfortunately, we didn't actually check the place out too closely. And we found ourselves in what you might call a pretty basic village near Montpellier, called Avignon. It's a village dedicated to wine and also dedicated to radical politics, as we discovered. An ancient village founded in 777, supposedly by a wandering monk, and not much improved really since 777. And of course, it has no parking space, like any village of that age. Now, Avignon was a bit rough around the edges, I have to say, but it was a really good way to experience, you know, a real French village as distinct from one of those very pretty Provençal French villages. It was so, well, here's a picture, which gives you a very good idea what the village was like on the interior. This was the street that we lived in. House was on the left there where the steps are. And this street was called Rue de la Tour, the street of the tower. The reason it was called that is that just at the end of it, just behind where the camera is standing, was a church tower that rang the hours and quarter hours, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So among other things, you didn't get much sleep for a while until you got used to that sound. After a while, it became quite soothing. So the streets were narrow, the streets were dark because the sun didn't get down into them. And they were very intimate because you were right up against your neighbors on every side. And although we had a very good year there and our neighbors were terrific, very, very helpful. For example, when I made the mistake of driving my little car into this street, I couldn't get it out again because the street was too narrow. They actually lifted it out for me. They sort of pushed and lifted it out backwards. There's a sharp curve just behind where the camera is, so it just wouldn't go around. So it was, it was a village experience. My goodness, it was. And it took us a little bit of a while to recover from that and decide that we wanted to find another French village. And you might say, well, after that experience, why a village? But I have no real excuse for that. It's just a very personal thing. Even though I was born in London, I just love villages, meaning places with no more than 2,000 or 3,000 people, no strip malls, no tower blocks, places where you can walk to the countryside in a few minutes. It always seemed to me, to paraphrase Tolstoy, that all cities are much the same, but every village is different. It's a sort of miniature culture in itself, and that's what makes it so very interesting. And I know that, having a taste for villages is ridiculously old-fashioned, like a taste for steam trains, but city is just too claustrophobic to me. I like to have people around, but not 10 million of them. And in a village too, it's worth saying there's a degree of trust once you've been established there for a little while. In spite of what you've seen on Midsummer Murders and Miss Marple, there's not a murder every week. Usually there's not a murder every week. There's also an urban myth that you won't be accepted in a village until your family's lived there for 300 years, but that's way out of date. Most villages are full of incomers and strangers. A new resident is something interesting, something to talk about, something new, and villagers need something to talk about. So we searched for villages in that region, which is called the Languedoc. I should say, might as well do a bit of self-publicity. We did write a book about that life in that first village, life in Avignon, called The Cats and the Water Bubbles. And to find out what's all that all about, you have to read the book. But we continued on and looked further west, really, a little bit further west, down towards the Spanish border. This is one of those classic pictures of the south of France, sunflowers and the lavender. But this area, Languedoc, it's now had its name changed and is called Occitanie, I should say, full of beautiful old houses like this, full of rugged landscapes. This little hut in the foreground is a shepherd's hut built of dry stone. And it's just the sort of place that you fall in love with again. And what we were looking for, I guess, is Peter Mayle's ideal village. A lovely little village with flowers and beautiful little streets and so on. They're hard to find. The ordinary French village is more like the one I just showed you. But we found this. This is Saint-Quentin-la-Poterie, as it's pronounced, more or less, and fell in love with it to the extent that we actually bought a house there the same week we arrived. Bought it from a man we met in a cafe, and it turned out to be a real bargain. Very small house, tiny house, and it happened to be the bottom of the housing market in France. And it happened to be the time when, in this country, Obama was going around saying, yes, we can. And so we looked at this and said, yes, we can. We could do this. We could buy a little house in this village. Then we wouldn't have to look for a place to stay every time we come to France. That's what we did. And once again, this is an ancient village, a village of narrow streets, but not quite as narrow as Avignon. You can see here, this is a photo. I'm sorry, it's got the photo area in France across it, but that's just a copyright note. You can see the village from the air. It sort of fulfills my requirements. It's all clustered together. You can walk a short distance and be out in the countryside. It's compact. The little square silver-colored block you can see down at the bottom of the picture is the market square. That's the covering of the market square. I'll get back to that later. But that's the village, the whole thing. And it had about 2,000 people in it. That's the same map again. We'll pass on from that. This is the main street. This is the street where in the old days the cattle drivers and the sheep farmers used to drive their animals through the village, and was also served as the main shopping street and everything else. It was called the Grande Rue, the great street, and it was about between 8 and 10 feet across most of the time. This was the house that we bought, tiny little house on the left here with a blue door and 3 stories. And as you can see, it's right bang on the street and quite high. Now, these old buildings are a constant effort to keep up, as you can imagine. Maybe what I'll do is to read you, if I can find it, one of the essays I wrote about this, because it sort of sums it up. Yeah. Okay, excuse me for reading, but I think this describes it quite well. When in France we inhabit a small village house, the word inhabit is appropriate because old stone houses have something of the feeling of cave dwellings, even if they're equipped with all the modern conveniences inside. The village has been here for more than 600 years. The first written mention of it by name occurs in 1152, by which date it was already well established. The basic layout of the streets has not changed much from a map made in the 1600s, and the nearby town of Uzès has been home to the Dukes of France for over 1,000 years. So naturally, we were interested in the history of this place, who lived here, and what their lives were like. But it was hard to get any reliable information. Village houses were built for peasants and artisans, and they don't appear in any written record. They've been built on, built over, and renovated for hundreds of years. So there's no overall architectural style, such as you might see in a church or a grand chateau. We have to rely on the clues we can get from the oldest parts of the building and the stories told by neighbors and by our handyman, Pascal. These stories are notoriously unreliable. There is something about the history of houses that makes even normally honest people lose their moral bearings. A house, especially an old one, is a subject for a romance, so the tales we hear have to be taken with a very large pinch of salt. We can be sure of one thing: our house is seriously old. The popular public television show This Old House claims to be about renovating antique structures, but their Brooklyn brownstones and Bostonian arts and craft home are brand new construction compared to this old house. Villagers built these places to last, using large chunks of granite. And because we're right in the middle of the village, the house is supported on both sides by other equally solid and ancient structures. Based on the stone vaulting in the lowest part of the house, we guess it was built sometime in the early 1700s. Animals were kept down there, and you can still see a stone drinking trough with an iron ring. Career opportunities were limited. The inhabitants may have worked in the vineyards or the olive groves and supplanted their incomes with milk, cheese, and wool from these animals. Also, from the 19th century on, the village had a small industry of pipe making, which led to its present reputation as a centre for ceramic art. So this old house has seen a lot of history. 8 kings, the French Revolution, 2 emperors, 2 world wars, and 5 republics so far. When it was first built, Louis XIV, the Sun King, was living in splendour in his palace in Versailles, oblivious to the revolution, which would sweep his royal descendants away. And in Paris, intellectuals like Voltaire were fomenting the philosophical revolution called the Enlightenment. But out in the country, life in villages like this must have been brutally hard, with hot summers and cold winters and back-breaking work, and not much in the way of entertainment apart from the occasional religious war. At first, the house seemed semi-sacred to us just because of all that heavy history. I even hesitated to drill a hole in the wall to hang a picture, but I needn't have worried. The electric drill just bounced right off the granite, and I had to hang the picture somewhere else. These old houses survive for a reason. They don't yield to storms, floods, earthquakes, or temporary occupants with electric drills. They are here for the duration, whatever that duration may be. So thanks for listening to that. That was a little essay. I was writing pieces for public radio while I was in France at that time, because I do that every week, been doing that every week forever, and sending them over. And that was one of my weekly essays just after we'd first arrived in the village. The business of renovation was kind of entertainment in itself, insofar as we had to hire people all the time to help us out, because a lot of the work was quite heavy work, especially with the granite walls and so on. And we had this handyman called Pascal, who I hired because I liked the name. I liked to have the idea of the thought of having a handyman who was named after the great French philosopher Pascal. And he did turn out to be something of a philosopher in the end. He would always take a great deal of time to think about a piece of work before actually doing it. Sometimes he would think about it for weeks. And we also found with the various people that we hired over the years that they also wanted you to participate. It wasn't a matter of just coming in and doing the job. It was coming in and getting you to help do the job, whatever it was. So you found yourself lifting tiles off the roof, or threading electric wires through the walls, or doing various things with the plumbing in the street, while the handyman was shouting instructions at you. They seem to expect a certain participatory handyman activity, but they don't give you any discount for that. One of the most interesting and striking things for me about living in a place like this, and in a place like France in general, it's another view of the same street, is that you're constantly in the presence of long periods of time of ancient history and ancient civilizations. It's like living in two places at once. In France, for example, you can go and see any number of historic sites, the caves of Lascaux with extraordinary paintings from 17,000 years ago, Gothic buildings built in the 12th century with, you can hear music composed in the 10th century, vast palaces like Versailles from the 16th and 17th centuries. Everywhere there's this appearance of history that you really can't ignore, you really can't, so you can't get it out of your mind in a strange sense. The nearby town to this village is called Uzès, and it's been home to the Dukes of France for over 1,000 years. It's the oldest dukedom of France, and it's still inhabited. In fact, this amazing looking castle, which looks like something built by Disney for a movie, by the present Duke Jacques de Croussol, who's happy to show you around his house for a price. And this town of Uzès itself is medieval and very, very fascinating. But there's much more deeper history than that. If we go outside of Uzès, this was a favorite place that we had, a charming valley beside the town. And it's the source of a stream that turns into this narrow river that you see here. Now, when the Romans came 2,000 years ago, they weren't about to neglect a gift like this. This was something fantastic. And they decided to use it to send water to their nearby city, the big Roman city of Nîmes. It's about 30 miles away across rough countryside. You need to think about this to appreciate how ambitious it was. They were going to take this little stream and send it 30 miles across arid territory with no mechanical machines, no diggers, no cranes, no surveying equipment of a modern kind. And they did it. The whole aqueduct, the whole 30 miles of the aqueduct descends just 41 feet over its entire 30-mile length. So it's a miracle of engineering, and you can see bits of it in the same valley. If you walk along a bit further, that's part of the old aqueduct, now covered over with earth. And if you follow it further along towards the city of Nîmes, you find a place where they came to a difficult problem, which was another valley right in the path of the water. Well, you can't very well send water down a valley and back up the other side. So they built an aqueduct, a very famous aqueduct, the Pont du Gard, from the 1st century. And there it still is, 2,000 years later. World Heritage Site, and just an incredibly impressive example of engineering and infrastructure. Romans really believed in infrastructure. There's a lot of talk about rebuilding our own infrastructure, but the Romans built it to some standards that lasted 2,000 years. And it's worth wondering, I suppose, who built this thing? You know, who was in charge? What kind of society creates such an extraordinary engineering work of art and science? And the answer is two of the most prominent Roman emperors during the building of the great aqueduct were Caligula, who was a madman, and Nero, who was a tyrant. Now, there must be a message in this somewhere. If only I can figure out what it is. But they were the ones who achieved this amazing feat. So history's everywhere. History's always in the back of your mind. And every village has a special identity based on something that it does or something that it was. The village of Avignon, where we were in before, as I said, was a wine village and a political village. Saint-Quentin-la-Potterie is a village dedicated to pottery, probably because of two reasons. One is because there's excellent pottery clay all around. You only have to walk out into the woods and dig down a little bit. And also because they had this old industry of pipe making, not just pipes for smoking, but also pipes for carrying water and so on. And so in the last 30 or 40 years, attracted by a particular mayor of the village, who was a woman, lots of ceramic artists have come to the village and set up their workshops, set up their potteries. And they're now, even though it's such a small place, there are 30 or 40 dedicated potteries around the village, and people come from all over Europe to buy the pottery. It's not just pots, but it's all kinds of ceramic work. The house we had, there was a potter on either side of it. And the whole village essentially is dedicated to that. There are big potteries like this one, Pottery Danushka. This is a Russian potter. And incidentally, these potters, as I say, come from all over the world. And there are little potteries around corners and back alleys like this one of our neighbors, the Pottery Natalie. And everywhere you look, there's a cafe of the potters. Everywhere you look, there are little exhibitions, as it were. As even on this windowsill, there's a whole exhibition of pottery. If you can see it, it's got cats and all kinds of pottery animals up there. Now, having come into a village like this, neither one of us knowing anything about pottery really, we decided we should get with the program. And the only way we could do that was to provide a space for some of the potters to exhibit in, because we had this wonderful space under the house, carve or cave, which looks as if it's ideal for a garage for your car, but because the street was so narrow, you couldn't actually turn a car into it without losing a good deal of paintwork on the stone on the side there. So we had it cleaned up by Pascal, of course, and wired up with some electric lights and made it into a gallery, essentially. And this allowed us to become, by the back door, a sort of a little bit part of the artistic community. And it was great fun because we had a series of people coming in, occupying the gallery at different times and exhibiting their works. It wasn't very big, it wasn't very fancy, it didn't have any elaborate lighting effects, but most of these potters were amateurs and semi-professionals, the only too pleased to have a place to exhibit their work. That's my wife sitting with one of the more strange exhibits. There was a fellow who came along, he called himself a confrontational potter, and he did pottery that was really unpleasant to look at, really obnoxious. And he just wanted to upset people, basically. And so he had his exhibit there for 10 days or a week or so. And people would come in and just sort of look at it and gasp and go out again. So we had all kinds, we had all sorts of people coming in there. If you walk around the village, and I'll take you on a little walk here, two things strike, I think. One is that the great majority of the village is built of grey stone, often covered with grey concrete. So it's grey. And in order to brighten it up, people have put splashes of colour everywhere. Wherever there's a place that paint will lie on, somebody's painted it. And usually, very often actually, this light blue, which seems to be the village colour. This is the most colourful village, or one of the most colourful villages in the street, also the widest street. Major traffic artery, as you can see, 2 cars. Another little corner there. Another little alleyway. There used to be a chateau here, and the chateau was just beyond this alleyway, no longer exists. And when it was pulled down, that must have been sometime in the 1600s or possibly in the 1700s, nobody seems to be sure. The villagers took good care to collect the stone for themselves. And so all over the village, there are bits of chateau built into people's houses, which gives the village a sort of interestingly multi-period aspect. You can see back on this picture here, over the archway, there are a couple of pillars, which obviously came from the chateau. And then on the wall at the left, at the front of the picture, there's a little angel or gargoyle of some kind. That also obviously came from the chateau. So they rebuilt their history into their own buildings. Here is a bookbinding business, something you wouldn't expect to find. And another colourful house, used to belong to some friends of ours. And another. You get these pictures are not carefully selected to show only the picturesque parts. That's basically the way it is. It's full of little corners and lovely little alleyways and colours. It's probably another very colourful house. Now, if you look out over the roofs, you see again a tremendous variety of rooftops, and a lot of painters have enjoyed these, I think, because there's a certain genre of painting that's still around, which goes all the way back to Picasso and Braque, Cubism. And if you're a Cubist or anything remotely like a Cubist, rooftops are just perfect. All you need is a ruler and some paint and you're on your way. And so painters have painted, but also it's a way of seeing the evolution of a place, just looking out over the rooftops and seeing the higgledy-piggledy fashion in which the villages developed without any kind of planning permission or planning authority over the hundreds of years. Roofs are also important to people, not just because they keep the rain off, but because of the winds. This is an area where there are a lot of winds, very strong, and with picturesque names, but the picturesque names don't really improve them. There's the Mistral, which comes from the north or northwest, Tramontane that comes from the north, Sirocco from Africa, and so on. And they bring tremendous storms. When the warm weather from the Mediterranean meets the cold air from the Cevennes Mountains a little bit further north produces tremendous thunderstorms, which sound as if they're right over your head. I've never experienced anything like it anywhere else, and tremendous deluges of rain. So it's important the roofs are really thick, heavy, and solid. If those slates blow around, they weigh about 4 or 5 pounds each. They can do serious damage. So roofing is a very busy occupation. There are roofers all over the place, and we had to have them in once or twice to repair our roof. Here's the other thing about the roofs is that they are home to hundreds and hundreds of cats of the village, mostly feral cats, mostly wild cats, who use them as a kind of continuous territory. Gets them up there away from dogs and people. And you can see here, this is a sort of favorite cat of mine, just outside the kitchen window. It's called the Gumby cat. And you can see here that the variety of the tiles, how many times they've been changed and replaced and switched around and so on. The tiled roofs are an absolute, what's the word I'm looking for? Not a palimpsest, but they're a sort of jigsaw puzzle of different pieces of work. And somebody asked me an interesting question apropos of the winds. Said, and it was a partially sighted person, asked me, how does the village smell? How does it smell? And I'd never thought about that, but it's a very good question. And so next time I was there, I sniffed a little and thought about it. And the answer was fairly clear. If the wind is from the north, that it's the Mistral, the smell comes from the pine woods just up on the north side of the village, very thick pine wood. So you get this beautiful smell of pines, but not the vines, which are further on still, just the pines. If the wind comes from the south, the Sirocco, then you get authentically the smell of Africa, because the Sirocco brings dust with it, right from the Sahara Desert. It's extraordinary. And you stand there and, hey, so this smells like Africa. This doesn't smell like France at all. Then, you know, if it comes from the east, then the Levanta, as it's called, that's where a lot of the potteries are, just to the east of where we are. And you get the smell of potteries, which is the smell of baking clay and paint. And from the west, I think the best smell of all, the bakery. The big bakery just down the street. You get a wonderful smell of croissants and things baking. On market day, of course, the smells are just incredibly mingled with all sorts of cheese and garlic and sausage. But it was an interesting question. How does the village smell? There are a lot of cats. If there's anybody who likes cats, here's another cat. This one was called Squeaky. This one didn't have a name. And here's a couple of pictures of how it used to be. And really, I just copied these pictures from old postcards because it struck me how very little most of the village has changed. You see here on the left of the Place de la Mairie in the 1890s, and the same place today, still the municipal building there in the middle with the French flag outside. Really, only the cars have changed. The clock tower, Place de l'Horloge in the 1890s, and again today, virtually unchanged. Certainly the clock tower building is the same. And the street we were in, the Grand Rue, once again, although the people in it are cleaner and tidier than they were in the 1890s, that scarcely changed too. Also the place of the monument of the First and Second World War, which has many, many names from the village from the First World War, but almost none from the Second, because the South was spared the worst of the Second World War. Move on. Okay, to read you maybe an essay or two now. I don't think I'll read this one, but I'll just tell you the story very briefly. We needed to get a car because we were paying for car hire. And we had considerable difficulty because we needed a number of things. One, we needed a car that would go into that garage space, that car that you just saw. And that was next to impossible. So we wanted a very small car. We wanted a cheap car. We wanted an old car, one that nobody would steal. And that's a difficult combination of requirements, as you know, cheap, old, very small. This is one that we came up with, and it would just about go into the car, but then we converted it into a gallery, and we couldn't get the car in there anymore. So the car had to be left out on the street. And we always hoped somebody would steal it, but nobody ever did. Let me just move on from that. Okay, move on to the French retirement system. It's got a lot going for it. You might have read about this. There have been lots of political battles in France about retirement and who can retire when. The basic retirement age is 60 for both men and women. 60 for men, 55 for women. For some particular occupations, like the railway workers, it's 55. But very few people work much longer than that, especially people in large organizations. So there's a lot of people who are not really old. I mean, I can't call them old at my age, but they're certainly getting there, you know, late 50s, 60s and so on. They've got nothing to do. Basically just, they've got time on their hands. And so one argument is this is a tremendous waste. You know, all these people who could be doing something useful, and they're just wasting their time away. But some of them are very, very useful. They help out in schools. They help out in, I'm just trying to find an essay here that I want to read to you. Excuse me. Just bear with me for a moment. Just admire these fellows. So much for efficiency. I thought I had this marked. Okay. Hold on. Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, right, I found what I wanted. This was one of those little radio essays which I put out from there. And I'll just start a little way into it. Having so many young people around, or young old people around, makes life more interesting. Consider this scenario that unfolded right outside our front door. It started with the postman. Postman said and complained that our door number was too small. As he knew all the houses in the village intimately and who lived in them, this was a strange kind of complaint, and we thought there must be a message in it. And there was. The message was that every house in the village had a matching number, painted in blue on a white pottery ground. And it's about 8 inches square. And all the village names have the same design, and we didn't. We had a sort of little black number on the door. So these plaques are made by the local potter, and we wanted to please the postman. So along we went and got one made. When the house number was made by the potter, I took a couple of screws and attached it to the front door. As you see in this picture, this is not the same door. I didn't take a picture of it for some reason, but this is the same situation. I attached it to the front door just like that, as anybody would. And our young retired neighbor, Francois, popped out of his door like a jack in the box and told us that that was no good. The plaque has to be on the left of the door, on the stonework, which is a much harder proposition because it means drilling into the granite. So I got my tools and spent a lot of time drilling into the granite. And I was just about to finish the job. And he Francois popped out again. He said, look, your screws are too small. I'll get some bigger ones. So he brought some enormous screws, which wouldn't fit into the plaque or into the wall. And we had to leave the whole thing till the next day. Okay, so next day he appeared with these two enormous screws, which were too big for the plaque, and another drill with which he very carefully and slowly enlarged the holes in the plaque until the screws would go into them, although my screws would have gone into them in the first place. Meanwhile, from across the street, another one of our young retirees, Raymond, appeared. I'm surprised it took him so long. And we explained the situation. He was horrified. He said, you can't put it there. It's going to be stolen. You have to put it there, point it to the top of the door. So we all discussed the security issue. And Francois won on the grounds that his screws were longer than anybody else's. Another day went by. Francois appeared with a huge drilling machine to make larger holes in the granite. And we had a long discussion in the middle of the street about where it would look best, where it would look, as they said, most jolly. And you wouldn't think that down-to-earth French village men would care about whether the thing looked jolly or not, but they did. And at last it was attached properly in the right place, not quite straight maybe. Everybody shook hands. And what had happened was, I realized afterwards, a tedious 5-minute chore had become a sort of piece of street theatre that occupied 3 elderly men harmlessly and happily for 3 days, which surely is better than having them wasting their time at some computer terminal or some dull office. And now, of course, the postman can find the house, although he could find it perfectly well before. In fact, he can approve of the house, which is much more important. And all this is thanks to the generous French tradition of early retirement. A great many people would like to give it to the president right now. So that's one of the miniature adventures that were to be had by living in a village like that. Another adventure was going for a walk. The vineyards were up above the village here, and I hadn't realized naively that vineyards turned golden in the autumn, just like trees, just like deciduous trees. And we walked up there quite a lot, but then we saw signs outside the mayor's office saying it's dangerous to walk in the vineyards or in the woods. You know, check with the mayor's office to see when it's safe, because lo and behold, it's hunting season. And the hunters are up there shooting at everything and everybody that moves. And so we went along to the mayor's office, and we saw a young woman who looked at me and said, I wouldn't advise it. She said, the hunters are looking for wild pigs. Maybe you should get a hat. And so I bought a red hat, and we went up there, and you know, they were popping away, but at least they didn't mistake me for a wild pig. But this was a whole great histoire of where you could walk and where you couldn't, because those hunters are really quite ruthless. This was the creature they're looking for, the sanglier, the wild pig. Just want to tell you one more little story from the village. The Friday market, which was a delight. That rather ugly cover there over the market is made in reinforced concrete, which reminds me to tell you that this village, although it had very little in the way of distinguished history, was the home to the man who invented reinforced concrete. And he lived there in the late 19th century, early 20th century, Monsieur Monnier. And so if you look around you and you see all those wonderful concrete buildings around the island, the concrete skyscrapers and everything, it's Mr. Monnier from Saint-Quentin you have to thank for it. These fellows. On the edge of the market, and probably on the edge of every market in France, there is a group of old men who gather. it's not so much a cafe society as a bar society. And St. Quentin had its group, and they called them the Senators. They called them the Senators because they did nothing but talk. There they were on the edge of the market every day. And apart from playing the occasional game of pool and making trips to the bar, which is right behind them there, they just sat on their bench. And they passionately discussed the questions of early retirements, the strikes, the demonstrations, the deficit, the Middle East, the price of olives, relative merits of all the local wines. I think that's what they're talking about. It's very hard to tell because there's a very strong regional accent, but nobody else discusses the issues of the day so thoroughly and so comprehensively and for so long as these old men, the senators. If you think about the politicians in Paris or politicians in Washington, they prefer not to discuss them at all. And the Greek marketplace, the ancient Greek marketplace, the agora, is described as the cradle of democracy precisely because citizens gathered there to argue about the things that matter to them. And so when the mayor, an excellent mayor in the village, Mayor Bonsi, came down, when he needed to know what was going on, or he needed to know what people's attitude was to some kind of street improvement or some problem, he would come down and talk to these guys because they knew everything and they had opinions. My goodness, did they have opinions? And it was a kind of real living democracy at work. I'm sure it wasn't the only people. These weren't the only people the mayor talked to, but he always talked to them because they were, in some sense, the center of the village. Now, one day I arrived at the market very early and I found that the bench of the senators was empty. And I felt, this is kind of exciting. I sat on it for a few minutes and I enjoyed the sensation of being at the epicenter of village politics, although I couldn't hope to be elected there. But when the bench is occupied, it's fully occupied. It's from end to end. So there's no room for anybody else. And I assume that it's like Washington, that an incumbent has to fall off the end before any vacancy occurs. So I wrote then that it's the kind of modest, down-to-earth Senate we need in Washington. Just a few talkative senior citizens, a rusty bench, some cheap red wine. That would accomplish everything that the present Senate accomplishes and more at a much lower cost. Their debates might be incomprehensible and confused and irrelevant and incoherent, but how would we know the difference? So the senators were a great source of inspiration to me. It should be an inspiration to everybody. I wonder if, Liz, are you still on the line?
Yes, I'm here.
Hello, Liz. I think this would be a good place to stop and see if there are any questions or anybody's put anything in the chat room.
Yes, there was
Could you check? Thank you.
There was one question. Was Ainane, A-I-N-A-N-E, Ainane, where you WSHU broadcast from?
Yes, that was, they pronounce it Agnan.
Okay.
And I was broadcasting there just because we were there and using the internet to get, well, there's a long story there, but I'll tell it very briefly. I was recording pieces to go to Fairfield, Connecticut for the radio station, and I was sending them to, by the way, the post office in cassettes, digital cassettes. And the post office, people in the post office, just a tiny post office there, became very intrigued by this. What am I sending to an American radio station every week? And so they had the wit to go to the internet, look up the radio station website and find that I'd been writing about their village. So suddenly the truth was out, as it were. So I had to be a little bit more careful about what I said. And I took to sending my commentaries on the internet instead of through the French mail. But yes, it's where I was for a year broadcasting from.
Okay, we have another question here from Tasha. What about indoor plumbing in the village?
Yes, we had indoor plumbing. It wasn't too brilliant, but yes, it did exist. I think for many people it was a fairly relatively new thing from the 1940s and 1950s after the war, because it always looked a bit as if it had been jammed into a corner somewhere, not built into the houses. But they did have indoor plumbing. They did have running water. Heating was not so good. People didn't have efficient heating at all because they, living in the south of France, they kind of imagined that it was summer all year round, which it wasn't. And the heating system that we had in that village was a diabolical oil stove, which required you to sort of stand about 6 feet away and throw a match at it in order to get it going. And then when it ran out of oil, it was almost impossible to get the oil man to come because the street was too narrow for his truck, and so on and so on and so on. It was one of those village experiences. But yeah, everything, some people had redone these old houses marvelously inside. You could step into them and they were just lovely, beautiful furniture, redecoration, but on the outside, you'd never know it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have another question. Can some tourists visit the south of France currently?
I'm sorry, say that again, Liz.
Can tourists visit the south of France currently?
Not from the United States, no. United States, France has blocked a number of countries that have got very high corona levels, and the United States is one of them. So you couldn't go, I think, you couldn't go at all. If you did go, you'd certainly be put into quarantine.
Mm-hmm.
And many, many towns, including these villages, are still under quarantine, partial quarantine. So even if you did go there, you couldn't do much.
Yeah.
It's absolutely killed the tourist industry.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Irma asks, did you have a running of the bulls on July 14th as they did in Tarascon?
Yes, there was. I didn't approve of it myself. I thought it was bad for the bulls and bad for the people who got injured during it. But it's one of those customs that's come up from Spain, just not very far from Spain here. And it's become a kind of a business. Every year there's a festival. Sometimes it's on the 14th of July, sometimes a different time. And the streets are barred off, as you can see in this picture here. And the bulls run down and the young men run out to try to wrestle the bulls to the ground, which is really, really stupid when you think about it. But it's all a kind of male display. You might have heard about that, male display activity. Yeah. It's slowly disappearing. There's a lot of opposition to it. And I think probably another 10 years, it'll be gone.
Mm. Here's another one. When did you emigrate to the colonies and how did he find himself in Stony Brook?
Well, it was after 1804, definitely. I actually came here in 1986 to live here. And the reason I found myself, I'd been here many times before, and I'd spent years in California for my sins and other places. But the reason I came to Stony Brook, and I'm still here, is that I got married to a Stony Brook professor. And I still am married to her. So that's what brought me here. And in spite of the pretty picture in the background, I'm still right here.
Linda asks, do you still have the house?
No, we had a stroke of strange luck there. At the end of last year, we decided to sell it, thinking to get maybe a bigger one in the same village in the following year. And we actually found a buyer, a wonderful young artist, female artist, who bought it straight off, just loved it, to make it into a gallery for herself and a workshop, a studio. And so that was done. We moved out. And then, of course, COVID happened. And everything came to a stop. If we hadn't sold it last year, we would have been in a rather sticky situation.
Mm. Here's another one. Are the cats taken care of by anyone?
The cats are no more, unfortunately. The cats are both passed on to a better world with more tuna fish and more arthritic mice. They've gone. We haven't acquired any more because we were expecting to be away a lot, but now things have changed. So I'm looking for a stray cat to wander past the back door.
Okay. Someone just made a comment. Encore, can we have another session?
Another session of?
Of you, I guess.
Well, what about, I wonder? I mean, yeah, if you want to do another session about another topic, and you've got it fits into your schedule, that would be fine by me.
Great.
I don't have to travel far to do it. But we'd have to.
So if anybody has any other questions, do you want to raise your virtual hand and we can answer them? Anybody has any other questions? I'm just going to go through and see if anybody else has questions for David. Michael, I'm going to ask you to unmute. Michael Marshak. Michael Marshak, you can ask your question. I don't know if he can hear me. Michael? Okay, we'll go to the next one. Doug Hodges.
Okay.
Doug?
Yeah. David, I'm just wondering, with so many areas of France, I mean, you could be in the Alsace region or in Normandy or in the Burgundy country. Did you choose the south of France for a particular reason?
Well, yes. I mean, Alsace I like a lot, but I like to be warm. And you've got a better chance of being warm in the south than in the north. So there is that. I like the landscapes. I love the landscapes. But I think partly it's familiarity. When you go back to a place year after year and enjoy it, it becomes like a second home. And you just want to go back to it. I've got nothing against the rest of France. But this is an area I just fell in love with a long time ago.
Thank you.
John Gobler, unmute yourself. You can unmute. John Gobler?
Yeah, two things, David. One is a number of years ago, one of the French classes from OLLI actually did a trip to that area on their own. Very enjoyable.
Mm-hmm.
We wound up all the ways down in Avignon and Arles, and then we took a bus tour over to Nice, or Nice rather. The other thing is, I just want to say, hey, thank you so much for this presentation, for all the years that you've done presentations for OLLI, on all the masters of music. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, John. Not that many years, I must say, but we did. The radio station actually took a tour to the same area about 5 years ago. It was wonderful for listeners, and we just had a great time. I was the leader of the tour, which was most unfortunate because I've got no sense of direction whatsoever. But there we go. Anyway, there's your back.
Let's ask Michael Marshak one more time. Michael, you're unmuted. Are you on the call? You can ask your question. I guess not. Any other questions before we end? I don't see anybody else. Let me just look in the chat. Someone mentioned my French village is Luc-sur-Mer in Normandy. Happy Bastille Day. Merci beaucoup for the presentation.
Happy Bastille Day too.
I think that's all the questions that we have. So, but a lot of wonderful comments, and we really appreciate you doing this, David. Wonderful.
Oh, pleasure. Pleasure. Thanks, Liz.